She was exhausted. Her back ached, her shoes had bitten into the skin of her heels, and her stomach rumbled with the reminder that she hadn't eaten since yesterday. But she stood up. On a packed evening train, when the world felt too selfish to spare even a glance, she rose from her hard-won seat and motioned to the man holding his sleeping son in his arms. A man in an expensive, yet rumpled suit. A man with weariness etched into his eyes. He blinked at her, surprised, almost offended, but the child stirred in his arms, and her silent insistence won. He nodded with a barely spoken, "Thank you," and sat down carefully, resting the child's head against his shoulder. What she didn't know was that in that one small act, selfless, invisible to most, she changed everything. For him, for herself, forever. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the unexpected beauty of life, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming stories to life. She didn't think much of it afterward. She just stood through the long ride, hand gripping the overhead bar, head tilted toward the window, the city lights blurring against the foggy glass. Her name was Eliza Marsh, 27, a part-time waitress juggling side jobs to pay off a mountain of medical bills left behind after her mother's death. She lived alone in a creaky apartment above a laundromat and had no one left in the world. No siblings. No friends she truly trusted. Life had hardened her, but not her heart. Eliza had learned that kindness didn't always bring rewards. In fact, more often than not, it went unnoticed. But that had never stopped her. Somewhere deep down, in the quiet of her soul, she still believed in being good even when the world wasn't watching. What she didn't know was that the man on the train had been watching. That man, Nate Ashford, was not what he seemed. Most people knew him as the elusive CEO of Ashford Tech, a rising star in the tech world who disappeared from public view after the sudden death of his wife 3 years ago. Few had seen the broken father behind the billion-dollar headlines, the man who'd traded corporate galas for sleepless nights and boardrooms for daycare centers. That day on the train, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a father, hanging on by a thread, trying to get his 5-year-old son Oliver home after a long day at the children's hospital. The boy had been born with a congenital heart defect. His life was a constant dance with time, doctors, and fragile hope. Nate hadn't planned to take the train. His car had broken down unexpectedly, and all he'd wanted was to disappear among the masses, unseen. But Eliza's gesture pierced through his invisible armor. She hadn't recognized him, hadn't looked twice at his expensive shoes or the branded leather bag slung over his shoulder. She'd just looked at the child, and cared. He saw her again the next week. On the same train, same time. This time, she was sitting in the corner, dozing off, head bobbing lightly with the rhythm of the tracks. He watched for a few minutes before waking her gently and offering his seat instead. She blinked up at him in confusion, but he smiled, warm and genuine. And just like that, the seed of something began to grow between them. They didn't fall into each other like fairy tales often promise. It was slow, awkward at first. He introduced himself as Nate. Not Nathaniel. Not the CEO. Just a man, a dad. She introduced herself simply, telling him about her jobs, her dream of someday opening a small bakery in memory of her mom, and her ongoing struggle with loneliness. He listened. For the first time in years, he really listened. Over time, their train rides became conversations. Then, coffee after the station. Then an occasional dinner when Oliver was with the nanny. But it wasn't until the night Eliza held Oliver in her arms during a hospital emergency, while Nate was stuck in traffic, that he realized he couldn't imagine a life where she wasn't part of theirs. She'd stayed calm through the chaos, whispering lullabies and keeping Oliver distracted while nurses prepped the IV. When Nate arrived, panicked and breathless, he found her holding his son like he was her own. But Eliza wasn't sure she belonged in their world. When she discovered the truth, When she Googled his name and saw the Forbes covers, the awards, the legacy, she felt betrayed. She disappeared for days, not answering his calls. In her mind, he belonged to a world she could never touch. One built on wealth, power, polished smiles. She was a waitress who walked dogs and mopped floors. She had nothing but debt and a heart that broke too easily. But Nate didn't let her go. He showed up at her diner. Sat through 2 hours of silent treatment. Then he stood in front of the entire late-night crowd, his voice raw, and said he didn't care where she came from. That Oliver asked for her every night. That he needed her more than he'd ever needed anyone. That she had offered him something no amount of money could buy, kindness without expectation. Eliza cried that night, quiet, trembling tears, because someone had finally seen her. They didn't become perfect overnight. Nate had to learn to trust again. Eliza had to learn she was worthy of being loved, not pitied. But together, they healed. Piece by piece. She baked again, first small batches, then with Nate's quiet financial help, a little storefront opened 2 blocks from Oliver's school. Millie's Bakery, named after her late mother. The place became a neighborhood haven. Warm bread, gentle smiles, and a little boy who ran around declaring himself the official cookie tester. The train rides still happened, now hand in hand. Eliza and Nate often sat together, Oliver bouncing on his father's lap, strangers around them unaware of the journey that had begun on those tracks. A journey sparked by one small act of kindness. And sometimes, when new parents sat across from them looking just as tired and overwhelmed, Eliza would smile and offer her seat again, because you never know whose life you might change when you give without asking anything in return. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please like, comment, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Share it with someone who believes in love, hope, and how one small moment can change everything. Speech balloon comment below. What would you do if one small act of kindness brought someone into your life forever? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Of course, here's the continued and extended version of the story to bring it closer to the emotional depth and length of an 8,000-word YouTube narrative. The pacing remains cinematic, vivid, and heart-touching. The winter after they met was especially brutal. Icy winds tore through the city, and snow blanketed the streets in silence. Eliza's hours had been cut at the diner, and the heating in her apartment barely worked. But she still showed up at the hospital when Oliver was admitted again, this time for a dangerous infection after his latest procedure. She brought soup she made from scratch, even though she barely had groceries left at home. She sat by Oliver's side when Nate had to attend emergency meetings. She braided his hair when he felt scared, told him stories about a flying lion who ate bad dreams, and sang songs in a voice so soft, nurses paused outside the door just to listen. To Nate, that winter became a test. A test of what truly mattered. He had been raised in a world where power was everything. His own father had been a ruthless businessman who measured success in dollars and obedience. Nate had once vowed never to become that man. But life and loss had made him cold. Until Eliza. She reintroduced him to simple things. Laughing without agenda. Caring without conditions. Sitting by someone's bed all night just because they might wake up afraid. Eliza, on the other hand, still wrestled with fear. Not fear of him, but of his world. She'd seen what people said about him online. Women in designer gowns he used to date. Paparazzi digging into his past. How would she ever survive the spotlight? Could someone like her, who still wore patched-up boots and rode the train because she couldn't afford a car, ever stand next to a man like Nate? But she didn't realize, to Nate, she was the light in a life that had once gone dark. One rainy evening, weeks before Oliver was scheduled for another surgery, Nate brought Eliza to an old, abandoned cafe tucked behind a row of forgotten buildings. The paint was peeling, the windows cracked, but the space had a soul. He handed her a set of keys. She thought it was a joke. But then he looked her in the eye and said, "Let's make your dream real. You gave my son warmth when he was freezing inside. You gave me a reason to believe again. This is yours, Eliza. Do it your way." At first, she refused. Pride stiffened her spine. She didn't want handouts. But Nate, gently, with tears in his eyes, said, "This isn't charity. It's an investment. In you. In who you are. In everything you've already given, freely, without ever asking for anything back." That was the first time she let him hug her without holding anything back. She buried her face in his coat and sobbed, not because she was weak, but because someone had finally believed in her without strings attached. Renovating the cafe became a project that changed everything. She named it Millie's, in honor of her late mother, who used to sell cookies from their tiny kitchen during holidays. The place filled quickly, first with neighbors, then with hospital staff who remembered her kindness, and eventually with strangers who'd heard about the woman who once gave up her seat to a father and son and changed the course of 3 lives. But not everything was perfect. One tabloid ran a story, "Mystery woman steals billionaire's heart, but who is she really?" It crushed Eliza. Her past was dragged into headlines, her mother's illness, her childhood in foster care, even an eviction notice from years ago. She cried for 2 straight days, locked in her bakery's stockroom. Nate offered to fight the press, sue them into silence, offer PR protection. But Eliza said no. "If I let them silence me," she whispered, "I let them shame the very journey that made me who I am." She walked back into her cafe the next day and baked 300 cookies for the children's hospital. She didn't just survive the scrutiny, she rose above it. Nate watched her with awe. And then came Oliver's surgery. The big one. The one doctors said would decide whether he could live a relatively normal life. The night before, Eliza snuck into the hospital and decorated his room with stars made of sugar paper, each one inscribed with a promise. "We'll go to the zoo. You'll help me bake your birthday cake. You'll run in the rain. You'll dance at my wedding." Oliver smiled sleepily and asked, "To Daddy?" Eliza's heart paused. She didn't answer. Just kissed his forehead and said, "You'll be there. That's what matters." The surgery took 8 hours. Nate couldn't sit still. He paced the corridor like a ghost. Eliza held his hand the whole time, never letting go. When the doctor finally came out, tired but smiling, Nate broke down in tears against her shoulder. Oliver made it. And, when he woke up, the first thing he asked was, "Can Eliza stay forever?" It was only 2 months later that Nate proposed. Not with fanfare. Not in Paris. Not in front of cameras. But in the back of Millie's, on a quiet Tuesday morning, while Eliza was rolling out dough with flour on her cheeks, he knelt down with a ring made from a spoon Oliver had bent into a heart. A symbol of imperfect love. Of things that don't need to be shiny to be beautiful. She said yes, through laughter and tears. They didn't need a grand wedding. They married in a garden filled with sunflowers and donuts instead of cake. Oliver wore suspenders and carried the rings. Neighbors, nurses, waitresses, and trained conductors came to celebrate. It wasn't elite. It wasn't elite. It was real. Years passed, and Millie's became a city landmark. A place where people came for comfort. For second chances. For stories. Eliza started a tradition. Every Sunday, she gave a free coffee to anyone who could tell her about a small kindness they'd received from a stranger. The wall behind the register filled with handwritten notes of humanity. Some silly. Some heartbreaking. All beautiful. And every time someone asked Nate how he met his wife, he'd smile and say, "She gave up her seat on a train." Because in the end, life isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it's about the smallest act that someone does when they think no one's watching. But someone is. Someone always is. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please don't leave without liking, sharing, and subscribing to Stories Collection. We create these stories to remind the world that love, hope, and humanity still exist. Speech balloon special request. Please comment below, what's the kindest thing a stranger ever did for you? We read every single one.